Compiled Contact Reports on Economics Part 4. Contact Report 706.
The United States of America and the European Union proclaim themselves to be democracies. But this assertive self-portrayal must not be judged truthful, because it is built on a popularly deceiving, popularly dulling, and truth-obscuring lie. The fact and the truth are that both state structures, both the United States of America and the European Union, each correspond to a devious dictatorship. All state officials of every department act high-handedly and outside the will of that part of the people who decide clearly and reasonably and act thoughtfully and who strive for peace, equality for all, but also for justice and real freedom, for just governance, state responsibility and its exercise, as well as for real democracy and for the fact that it is not the state powers alone, their advisors, followers, the military leaders, secret services, as well as the economic magnates, but only the people who decide and determine. But all this is not understood and not recognized by a part of the peoples concerned, because they have no knowledge of what is to be understood by democracy, peace, justice, and real freedom, as well as responsibility of state leadership. Consequently, they willingly follow the unfit state leaders and all the forces of all departments belonging to them, because they allow themselves to be beguiled and persuaded by words in their instability, their undermined intellect, in their lack of reason as well as in their lack of self-decision-making ability. But if I now have to explain what needs to be said with regard to the United States of America, its foreign policy and its real multifaceted endeavors, then this paints a very unpleasant picture that could give the impression that the entire U.S. American people are to be slandered, denounced, and betrayed, or in other words, blackened, denigrated, maligned, exposed, and disgraced. This, however, does not correspond to the meaning and truth of my statements, nor is it intended to create hatred against the U.S. American people. The truth of my statements refers only, and really only, to the fact that the whole unpleasant and negative assessment of the attitude of the entire U.S. American system of government is addressed, in which the state leaders, their advisors, the lobbyists and the entire politics, the secret services and economy, the religious system and the military power, but also that part of the U.S. people whose attitudes conform equally to what corresponds to the entire striving, leadership, financial and power behavior of the U.S. leadership and the associated powers of all departments. The U.S. American population, that is to say, the human beings, are not attacked with my explanations, statements, and declarations, but only the attitudes and the executions and the committing of wrong actions, deeds, and behaviors are mentioned, which are founded in intrigues, deceptions, deceitfulness, and criminal manipulations and conspiracies which lead up to torture, murder, and war. This is because on the part of the government, with the entire apparatus of all branches of power, criminal planning and action is being taken in violation of peace, freedom, justice and order, international law, human rights and the law, and in a way that is unlawful, criminal, unlawful, and vile. Everything corresponds to an attitude and an action, conduct and deed which can only be described as shameful, reprehensible, and contemptible, abominable, ignoble, dishonorable, nefarious, and evil. But what must now be explained with regard to the question concerning the United States of America is the following. The USA keeps all the regional states of the earth under its dominating supervision under strict control, whereby these cannot develop further, cannot strive higher, and cannot determine themselves, but are as good as dependents and vassals of the USA, which imagines itself to be the only world power and wants to exist in this way, with all its dishonest infiltrations. For this reason, the USA does not want peace, but hates it, and does everything to keep all the states under its control, down with the same means of oppression, and to keep them small and unable to act for themselves. The USA intervenes actively in the affairs of other states under its control, politically, financially, as well as militarily, secretly, economically, and even religiously, when this seems necessary and beneficial. But it also interferes everywhere in foreign problems and circumstances which are none of its business. In doing so, However, they are tormented by the constant fear that other states, especially Russia and China, might give them politically, militarily, secretly, diplomatically, and economically damaging competition, and also that certain government leaders of other states, such as Russia in particular, might undertake efforts towards world peace and also encourage other states to do so. This miserable fear, anxiety, and threat of the U.S. American rulers, military and secret services have existed since the foundation of the United States of America, among various other profoundly low, unprofessional, and empty motives, and have always caused all those in charge to thwart any peace efforts that have been undertaken in numerous states on Earth since ancient times and are still being renewed today in the third millennium. Since the United States of America has been in existence, it has not allowed peace to come about among the peoples of Earth, for it does not want peace but hates it, because on the one hand it is afraid of losing the far-reaching power it has built up on Earth, and on the other hand because it would have to give up its striving for world domination. From the U.S. side, everything violent is done and undertaken at all costs against peace on Earth and with regard to their desire for world domination. And this is being done first and foremost according to the power-driven will of those responsible for the government, the military, the secret services, and the economic powers, but also according to the will of that section of the population which is dependent on the government, the secret services, and the economy, and absolutely against the will of that minority of the population which is striving for peace and freedom with reason and intellect, and is also making efforts to achieve this with appeals and peaceful demonstrations, etc. The incontrovertible fact is, because the USA neither want nor strive for a far-reaching nor a worldwide peace and also no true freedom, but want to seize world domination, that there is absolutely no will to bring about an actually truthful abandonment of nuclear physics, just as no responsibility and no interest can arise with regard to an end to the further development of even more dangerous and destructive and ultimately all-destroying nuclear weapons. So there are also no efforts for nuclear disarmament, in order to free the Earth in honest and reasonable cooperation with all other nuclear powers from this world existence-threatening scourge of fear and destruction, which was created by the USA and used nefariously and criminally in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and since then has been constantly developed further, and up to the present time has become a danger of planetary destruction and human extinction. This, while also in their own country sacrilegiously and reprehensibly crimes were committed against their own ignorant population, by ordering their own military, actors, internees, and private persons, etc., into areas, letting them in and deliberately contaminating them with radiation, by exposing them to atomic experiments with atomic bomb tests, and contaminating them with radiation. Of course, it could not fail that through espionage and scientists, other states also took up nuclear research and developed nuclear weapons of various kinds, thus creating further nuclear powers and also the danger of an all-destroying and all-devastating nuclear war. And this danger has persisted to this day, and it has even been rekindled by the new hostilities of the United States of America and the dictatorship of the European Union, as well as various supporters of these two dictatorships, as a result of the hateful and hostile machinations against Russia. Despite the partial disarmament of nuclear weapons, the threat and danger of the use of nuclear weapons, and thus of nuclear war, triggered by the nuclear powers in armed conflicts, but also by extreme terrorist organizations in possession of nuclear weapons, is very great. Moreover, all the nuclear powers still have more nuclear weapons than is officially admitted, although not even this larger number of nuclear weapons would be necessary to destroy and even annihilate the Earth to such an extent that all life on the planet would be destroyed and none could exist anymore. Just a small part of the officially known and existing nuclear arsenal of the largest nuclear powers would be completely sufficient for this. But to stay with the United States of America, of which I speak with regard to your questions, it is to be said that in view of all the facts mentioned so far alone, it can be stated that the hostility to peace and the hatred of peace, as well as the permanent addiction to world domination of the rulers of the USA and their supporters from the population will be carried far into the future. The irresponsible and power-wielding part of the state leaders, as well as their incompetent advisors, secret services and economic powers, etc., but also that part of the power-obsessed and warmongering elements of the military leaders and military-obsessed from the population of the United States of America, persist in the same delusion as was the case at the early times of the formation of this multi-state structure. Even then, many outlaws committed serious crimes, just as many state officials acted criminally, because they were just as shamed, conscienceless, and criminal-minded as many of their successors up to the present time. Already in early times, the rulers in the USA exercised their power and abused the trust towards that part of the population which was straightforward, capable and blameless, as is still the case today, but as will also be the case far into the future, also in undemocratic other states of the earth. Unfortunately, since time immemorial, the peace-seeking minority of the U.S. population has never had a chance to intervene in politics in order to achieve a political turn towards peace with good, correct, and peace-demanding interventions. Even demonstrations demanding peace never achieved anything, because they were not only disregarded by the rulers, military, security forces, and secret services, but ridiculed or stopped with violence. The people striving for peace, as a minority in the United States of America, never had a chance of ever achieving success, as was and is also the case everywhere else in the earth. Therefore, only the rulers of the state and their allied military, secret services, security forces, and that part of the population which unanimously agrees with the machinations of the state leaders and their fellow travelers, and consents in every way to all their manipulations, always win. This, while the smaller part of the population, which thirsts for harmony, peace, freedom, justice, reconciliation, and solidarity with all peoples and states and is righteous, is fundamentally disregarded in spite of many pacifist efforts, or, under certain circumstances, is even harassed and punished by the security forces and those who obey the rulers. In the same way as it happens in the United States of America, it also happens through the European dictatorship headquarters in Belgium, as well as in the states affiliated to it, whose governments and peoples are ruled by the European dictatorship and who in turn dictatorially impose strife and lack of freedom on their peoples. But also in many other states, the same picture and events arise because the peoples, due to their psychological cluelessness and lack of knowledge of human nature, allow themselves to be misled, impressed and deceived by false, deceitful, and lying promises, hypocrisies, and pretenses of false facts by candidates standing for election to government and other state offices. And this happens because the candidates for state offices, etc., conceal their true lowly ruling and power-seeking sentiments behind false friendly, deceiving and beguiling gestures, facial expressions, gesticulations and facial expressions, and vow with false words of honor and promises to do only the very best for the people if they were elected to the office in question. And this they do, although they are completely of the opposite mind and unwilling to keep and fulfill their promises if elected to their offices. As a rule, the candidates for government positions and other state offices, etc., who appear in this way, are only concerned with gaining and exercising power, and thus with being able to rule over their fellow human beings, or the people. Another kind of human beings who seek candidature for governmental and state offices is probably of good and honest mind and will to do their best for the government, the people and the leadership of the state, as well as for peace, justice, and freedom, and to do this honestly and well with all the means and opportunities at their disposal. However, if they then get into their elected office, then everything changes for them in a negative way, because on the one hand, they are either suggestively redirected by their internal collaborators, advisors, leaders, and dominators, etc., to their dominating power behavior and brought to their sense and will. Consequently, they then act in the same power way and also behave accordingly. On the other hand, however, it is possible that honorable, persons who have been elected to corresponding state offices, who have all the good intentions for a righteous conduct in office, and are also willing to reliably and trustworthily carry them through and implement them, are not given any chance whatsoever to carry through their intentions and aspirations. The possession of nuclear weapons never gives a reason to assume a hostile military threat by other states. To maintain this threat assumption, and to claim fatuously as well as illogically and foolishly that in return only with own threats and a dangerous nuclear arsenal peace security can be guaranteed. It is rational and reasonable to consider and understand that neither small nor large stockpiles of nuclear and conventional weapons can be a guarantor of security and peace, but only a guarantee that such weapons will be used without hesitation, and that populations will be murdered and immense destruction wrought if any conflicts with combat weapons take place irresponsibly, or even if wars are instigated. And such weapons of all kinds are produced especially in great masses in the United States of America, and sold to many states, whereby, however, only those are taken into account which, on the one hand, can be made politically, militarily, and economically dependent on the USA through the purchase of weapons, but which, on the other hand, also become a guarantee that the U.S. Americans striving for unrestricted world domination can be maintained. So also the arms sales practiced by the USA all over the world, as well as many other things, correspond to devious intrigues, which serve the purpose of striving for a world-dominating might through all kinds of intrigues, cross-directions, plots, infiltrations, subversions, government overthrows, criminal Secret Service operations and fraud maneuvers, as well as cunning manipulations, etc. For the United States of America, the use of military gay vault has always been, and is also today, tomorrow, and in the as yet unforeseeable future, an option. Another, peaceful and free alternative would be diametrically opposed to the foreign policy that has been orchestrated and carried out for many years, and since the existence of the USA, which has always ensured that U.S. America can assert its political, military, and economic interests in an international manner, as well as its world-dominating tendencies. The fact is that it is not the USA that has to be afraid of enemies. Due to its arsenal of war weapons and its military and air force, it is too powerful to be attacked by smaller states. Consequently, only another great power would have a chance against it. But many states of the world have to be afraid of the USA, namely of the invasion attempts, that is to say, the violent invasions of the USA. They must also be afraid of possible annexation maneuvers or forced final incorporation under the rule of the United States of America, caused by wars or any underhanded political, military and Secret Service infamous U.S. machinations. Of course, it is the case that the state and military powers, the Secret Services and those responsible for the economy, their advisors and other fellow travelers deny everything in this respect just as cholerically, energetically and bitterly as that part of the population which is in every respect in bondage to these irresponsible people in state positions and, moreover, is completely ignorant of their real far-reaching secret machinations striving for world domination and the intrigues connected with it. The USA is ready at any time, if it is of use to them, or if it is a matter of their so-called state security, to brand foreign states as alleged bad guys without hesitation, and to attack and completely destroy them under certain circumstances. And as it has happened in various countries since time immemorial, President George Walker Bush, who branded various states as the axis of evil, let the U.S. Army invade Iraq with tremendous spreading of lies, as his equally bellicose father George Herbert Walker Bush did before him during the First Gulf War. And as usual with the USA regarding their world power ambitions, it remained and remains the case that once they have invaded a country, they keep it occupied for all time, or impose their U.S. demands, intrigues, policies, and, if possible, their laws, etc., on the respective states. In this way, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was also deposed and executed. If the morality of those in charge of the state, the military powers, the Secret Services, and the economic powers of the USA is considered, as well as the majority of those in charge of many other states, then it is clear and undoubted that all irresponsible people among those in charge, can always find an argument for an attack, etc., on other countries, even for a nuclear attack, and this without any prior provocation of the state in question that is to be invaded. This is fact, whether it wants to be understood or not, because this is the true side of U.S. foreign policy. All honorable, righteous, and responsible human beings of all states of the earth striving for peace and freedom are unfortunately in the minority, because a part of each people has fallen into the indifference and bondage of the state officials and the other state forces of all shapes and sizes, and these do not take their responsibility for state leadership and state security, as well as for the creation of peace, but act and work completely irresponsibly in the opposite direction, and this also against the welfare of the population. Therefore, it is also of no use if the reasonable human beings striving for peace unite and try, through peaceful demonstrations, to relax the governments and their entire hostile state apparatuses by demanding peace. So it is of no use if the minority of the population demonstratively formulates the wish to end the formal hostilities that have existed among human beings since time immemorial. Therefore, on Earth and with its humanity, the attainment of comprehensive peace can only be a very long-term goal, which all states can only approach very slowly through reason and rationality, and in doing so must be mindful of and learn to proceed in harmony and peacefully, and to walk together in good, without strife, non-violently, amicably, conciliatorily, and agreeably. However, all earthly states and a part of the populations have always stood in the way of this goal, with the USA standing out particularly in this respect, which must make a great effort to become reasonable and give up its desire for world power in order to bring about peace for the world, instead of fighting it as it has done up to now. Unfortunately, however, the USA is not making any effort in this respect, but is doing everything in the opposite sense to create enmity in the world among all states and peoples on the one hand, and on the other hand to continue its desire for world domination by all evil means and intrigues. A peaceful unification of all states and peoples is not in the interest of U.S. foreign policy, but only the effort and desire to accelerate the achievement of world domination. And there is no doubt whatsoever that this will always involve vicious armed force, as has been proven time and again since time immemorial, whereby even supposedly good and moderate U.S. leaders ultimately based all their actions and deeds on violence, war, and the U.S. weapons potential. This is what even the supposedly oh-so-sane President Barack Obama let slip when he threatened at the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice to let the war beasts off the leash if necessary, in something like the following threatening words: "The United States of America will maintain for all time by far the most powerful military the world has ever known." Yes, we most certainly will. And this statement probably proves very well the true sentiments of the USA, as is also made clear by the fact that Obama at that time prevented the disagreements prevailing between North and South Korea from being settled. And how the so much peace-loving and reasonable Barack Obama spoke and acted at that time, completely contrary to all his election promises. The same picture emerges also at the present time, when the stupidly insolent warmongering threats, speeches, demands, and confused orders, as well as the irresponsible actions and deeds of the U.S. President Donald John Trump, are closely examined and judged. If the global situation is viewed and understood from a U.S. perspective, then it is very easy to see that the United States of America is an overwhelming political, economic, intelligence, and military, and thus also arm-strong might, which it uses to make more and more states and peoples around the world dependent on the U.S. and to dominate them underhandedly. And they also use this might, on the one hand, to further expand their sphere of influence throughout the world, and, on the other hand, to prevent any other competing powers from getting ahead of them in their striving for world domination. But they also use their power to prevent the states in question from working their way up and attaining power of their own. These are the three most important reasons for the United States of America to intervene politically. militarily, economically, and commercially in various countries around the world again and again, as well as to carry out secret service actions and to cause unrest in foreign states. This would be the most important reason for all states and peoples of the earth to make peaceful and reasonable efforts to restrict and control the United States of America in its criminal actions and deeds in this regard and in its delusion of addiction to world domination. This, however, would require all states and peoples to stand together in unity and to act together in a peaceful manner in this regard, because it is impossible that one state and people alone could achieve anything to induce the USA to a peace process. Ongoing attempts in this regard alone are useless, as are unilateral alliances with the USA that are only aimed at their advantage, because such alliances are in any case doomed to failure in terms of peace and freedom for the sole benefit of the USA, and thus for world peace and freedom. The truth should finally be recognized that the foreign policy of the United States of America not only interferes with any attempt to create world peace and freedom, but will never allow them to come about globally, which is why they continue their intrigues. And they do this by not allowing weaker states to emerge, but first supporting them in many ways, only to then again, surreptitiously and unnoticeably contain and weaken them when they have developed, according to the guidelines and formal agreements given to them for the benefit of the USA. The intrigues for the purpose of achieving the set goal are manifold and range from trade sanctions to supporting rivals and creating new U.S. bases in suitable riparian areas. Then it finally comes to this, because it is necessary for the U.S. to gain power in the state in question, that first relatively small specialized U.S. troops of various disciplines are infiltrated into the country in question in order to block its own might, destabilize it, and surreptitiously bring the whole region under U.S. control.
Contact Report 707.
However, the majority of the religious sectarian delusion of faith prisoners do not notice how the religions and sects, as well as the religiously oriented society and the politicians, state powers and their vassals, as well as the secret services, military and the economic powers restrict their lives, whereby it is already the case today that all these power elites almost completely control every single human being. Unfortunately, the current understanding of the elite in all politics and related concepts only corresponds to the lust for power of human beings who hold public office, belong to lobbyism, populism, consultancy circles, organizations, the economy, the military and secret services, etc., and who usually only speculate on top positions with higher and more extensive personal power. Here, any personal integrity no longer has any significance, but only the unrestrained behavior of power and the greed for immense highly translated remuneration play a role, and this much worse than is the case in the mass of the populations. From a general point of view, a human being related elite Latin elegere or ex legere, to select, is described as a sociologically actually or presumably above average qualified grouping of persons who function, for example, as functional elites, performance elites, power elites, economic elites, ruling elites, state leadership elites, as influential elites or circles of a society. The coming times will continue to bring no good, because after the wars over oil and natural gas, there will soon be wars over drinking water as a result of the rapidly growing overpopulation, whereby the disaster in this regard has in fact already begun some time ago. But this has not yet penetrated the world public. In fact, more and more is going down the drain, as a result of which it is hardly to be hoped that reason will prevail, and a worldwide birth stop and an effective global birth control will be introduced in order to stop and drastically reduce human growth. And as long as this is not done, there can also be no hope of a reasonable return to a bipolar world order, better still, to a multipolar one. It would be very important for Russia, China, and India to build up and expand their influence in this respect. But this could only happen afterwards if these states first build up their own states and the whole of Asia in a multipolar way, and protect them from any and all rotten and infamous interventions and machinations of the USA. Therefore, a monopolar or unipolar world must be prevented, in which one state would dominate all the others. as this corresponds to the U.S. American aspiration and, moreover, only benefits the 1% of humanity that is unimaginably rich and unscrupulous, or a state entity such as the United States of America, if it can hegemonically bring the entire world under its power-greedy thumb with its immense armed force and arsenal. But this must never be allowed to happen, which is why a multipolar worldview and world order must be striven for and created, in which the distribution of might is balanced, which means that all states have an equal relationship to each other. No state may dominate over another. Until now, a few large industrial nations have shaped the global economy for many decades, but this is now coming to an end, because this prosperous or economically well-developing era is now being followed by a multipolar world system, especially for the Western world, which no longer tolerates small countries that are dependent on the big ones and are oppressed and exploited, because what the future must now bring can and must only be multipolar. Therefore, not only must political relations be changed and put on the scales of progress, but effectively the entire world economic order must undergo a completely revolutionary restructuring. This is also necessary because more and more emerging countries are actively participating in the world market and are no longer willing to be exploited and oppressed by the industrialized and large states. In this context, it must also be taken into account and understood that the innovation performance of small states has also increased significantly in the past decades, just as their production and the development of more complex products have increased.
Contact Report 712 Material Poverty.
In many countries there are many poor human beings, whereby poverty for them means that they have a lack of all conceivable essential and necessary things, predominantly not enough food, no warm clothing, and no housing suitable for them. So this form of poverty also means that the human beings do not have enough money. On the one hand, this is because they do not earn enough through their work, if they have such a job, or because they are paid inferior wages, or because they are unemployed.
Attention poverty.
This form of poverty means that the human being receives too little attention and care, because interpersonal relationships have atrophied to such an extent that there is no longer any respect or consideration for the neighbor, and alienation from one human being to another has become the order of the day. In the last decades, an increasingly blatant emergence has been observed in this respect, an inattention and lack of attention towards fellow human beings, which is also becoming more and more widespread today and in the future, making human beings poorer and poorer in terms of good interpersonal relationships. But this also means that there are more and more poor children who, outside the parental home, are only treated lovelessly by their fellow human beings without attention and affectionate care, who are pissed off and insulted, which leads to their being retaliated against or intimidated, and ultimately to rebellion and asocialism. This inevitably arises when other persons in their immediate or wider circle engage in extremely unfair and mean machinations against them, turning them into anti-socialists. In this way, children become poor because of various negative machinations on them by known or unknown adults, or even their parents, making them poor in terms of attention and care.
Emotional poverty.
Parents and adult relatives very often spend less and less time with their children and godchildren, etc., and in many cases it is also the case that they themselves are completely incapable of emotional emotions, as a result of which they cannot show affection to their children and godchildren either. This means that they do not listen to the children, just as they cannot take them in their arms or comfort them when they are sad or distressed. Therefore, whenever children are neglected and left alone, we must speak of emotional poverty. As is the case with children, it is also the case with parents or other adults, for all adult human beings also have the same natural impulses within them, even if they have suppressed them in the course of their lives through all kinds of negative and evil moral precipitation, and have sunk them into a deep abyss. But they continue to exist underground, and can be awakened again.
Sociocultural poverty.
At the social level, human beings who do not conform to the sociological norm are usually excluded from society, and this norm also applies to human beings who live in material poverty. So it is that these human beings, because they are poor and have no money, etc., also do not participate in community leisure activities or cultural activities such as concerts, any other performances or events, etc., because their being poor excludes them from everything social. The most frequent cause of sociocultural poverty is also based on unemployment, as can also be the case with other forms of poverty. In various countries, this is particularly the case because there is not enough work for all human beings, precisely because on the one hand, the massive overpopulation has more human beings than there are jobs, while on the other hand, the countries are already overcrowded and overloaded with jobs in every conceivable possible field of work. This means that the entire infrastructure is already overloaded, precisely the necessary economic and organizational substructure that is indispensable as a prerequisite for the supply and utilization of the entire area and comprehensively for the economy of the country in question. Of course, human beings can also become unemployed because they have to leave and give up their jobs as a result of bankruptcy or other abandonment of the enterprise. But it is also the case that many human beings work diligently all day long, but still do not earn enough, as a result of which their wages are not enough to feed themselves or their families, and pay for everything they need. And this sometimes does not happen even if a small income is earned additionally through a side job. But even with this, the necessary allowance is still not enough to be able to pay for everything. Too little pay alone can not only be the cause of material poverty, because if additional work is done, this can also lead to human beings not being able to spend enough time with their families, which causes serious relationship problems, because too much work has to be done. So this often leads to family hardship and problems that can trigger various forms of poverty, such as problems of alienation in relation to spouses and children, which ultimately leads to the separation or divorce of the parents, as well as when money is scarce, when the wage income of one or both partners is not enough for living expenses, rent, health insurance, and all other necessities.
Contact Report 714.
If a mountain of debt piles up more and more, then the whole thing becomes more and more threatening, be it in a private, business, or state way, in companies, businesses, corporations, in agriculture, or in any other business, etc., because ultimately the debt can lead to ruin. If we look at the debt situation in general today, the fact is that almost everything in the world, so also Switzerland, is in debt: the populations, the states, the industrial nations, and the emerging countries. If we look at the world's most important economies, their debts amount to more than twice their economic output. There is no end in sight, not only for the debt-ridden population, but also for all states themselves, as well as for the industrial groups, companies, farms, and small and large enterprises of all kinds that live on credit. Strictly speaking, debts are always harmful because large amounts of interest have to be paid for them, which, if they were saved, would more or less quickly replenish the finances that are needed and for which debts are incurred. And that is the case in every case. The obvious uneasiness that strikes reasonable human beings at the word debt is in fact fully justified. Debt has no economic raison d'être at all, because one person's debt is always another person's claim, who insists that interest be paid for lending the money owed. It is true that from an economic point of view, it is undisputed that credit increases the welfare of an economic system. But when the whole thing is effectively investigated, other results emerge, which are ultimately that the population is being financially sucked dry. The prices of everything and anything are being driven up higher and higher, and all the essential goods and flats and houses, etc., are becoming more and more unaffordable. Not least also because all the debt-making companies, businesses, farms, corporations and enterprises, etc., can no longer bear the horrendous interest on debts and the hassle of contracts, lawyers, maintenance needs, and production, etc., without driving up prices. And because everything does not always work out as it should, insolvencies are inevitably part of the daily routine, as was already the case in ancient times, from which the earthlings have learned nothing up to the present day, and continue to run up debts in a moronic manner. If it were still as it was in ancient times, then extremely draconian punishments would be meted out, because if debts were incurred in those days, but these or the interest on them were not paid, then the result was, for example in ancient Rome, that the debtors were divided in two, lost their freedom, or were sold as slaves in other countries, as Babylonian records tell us.
Contact Report 716.
The characteristic properties of each rare earth element are very different and exceptionally interesting. For example, gadolinium is the only rare earth element that is ferromagnetic, or lanthanum, which is a superconductor that loses all resistance to current flow at very low temperatures. These characteristics give each element an economic importance and are nowadays indispensable components in the production of metal alloys, special glasses, and superconductors. In China, rare earths have also been used for about 30 years to fertilize soils and feed livestock. Crops are said to produce significantly higher yields, and farm animals grow faster and have better feed conversion. Individual elements of the rare earth group and the group itself are traded either as raw materials or in a derivative form such as futures, options, certificates, on international stock exchanges. An investor can only invest in the form of shareholdings in mining companies that explore or extract these metals. Their economic importance far exceeds their level of familiarity. The rare earths. Without them, almost nothing works in communications or environmental technology. The special metals are the precious metals of the 21st century. Without them, we are thrown back into the 20th or even 19th century. As the technological applications of rare earths have multiplied in recent decades, the demand for several of the less common and formerly quite obscure rare earths has increased dramatically, judges the U.S. Geological Survey USGS. Erbium, for example, increases the performance of fiber optic communication cables. Europium is used as red phosphorus for screens of monitors and televisions, and cannot be replaced by any other substance. Rare earths, including cerium, are also used for autocatalysts. The fact that China is the largest producer of rare earths appears to be quite problematic for two reasons. Firstly, because of the danger of economic dependence, and secondly because of the environmental impact of extracting the coveted raw materials. Through all this, the whole world is being changed in such a destructive way that, due to the indisputable fact of declining economic growth, most developing countries will inexorably work more and more rapidly towards decay and ruin in the next 2 to 3 decades, and will eventually fail completely. And the fact that for years there has been an unmistakable worldwide urge on the part of human beings for ever faster education, especially with regard to modern electronic technology and various sciences, does not, contrary to all the lies of statisticians and well-known organizations, have any effect on general declines in birth rates, because birth rates continue to rise year after year, with the result that the climate is being more and more destructively influenced by the constantly growing human beings. And the fact that the industrialized countries continue to invest more and more in these countries year after year does not change the whole disaster, not even in the sense that huge amounts of these investments disappear into dark channels, and some of the people in power, etc., in these countries enrich themselves with them. On the other hand, large amounts of these investments also find their buyers as bribes. Just as aid organizations of all kinds enrich themselves with donations from bona fide, generous and compassionate helpers by collecting, legally secured, 40% of the donations for their own expenses and remuneration for their oh-so-benevolent aid work. Well, the intensification of economic relations between the industrialized countries and the developing countries is also to be looked at and considered, because since there is neither a birth stop nor birth control, there will be about 1 billion more human beings living in them within another decade, or in 1.5 decades, making all the world's problems much bigger than they already are today. And it will be inevitable that hundreds of thousands and even millions of human beings from all the developing countries will migrate to the prosperous industrialized countries in the next 2 decades, as well as afterwards, and want to live there, the beginning of which has already been created in the course of the last few years as a result of the intelligent ignorance of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel with her welcome culture. The fact that human beings from larger and richer countries such as Brazil, China, India, Australia, and South Korea are moving to Western industrialized countries has also been apparent for a long time, as has the fact that the entrepreneurial business enterprises of the countries mentioned are increasingly not only integrating themselves into the world market, but are also spreading out in the industrialized countries and buying up huge areas in the developing countries and making huge profits with their businesses. This is helping many people in various strata of the population to find work and a better life, although the majority of the population is not getting out of poverty. This corresponds to a process by which certain rulers and business people, etc., of the developing countries come into contact with like-minded people in wealthy industrialized countries and become filthy rich, from which, however, not the peoples of all countries, but only their economic and state leaders and all other rulers and financial jugglers, etc., make profits and ever greater billions. They can make profits and shovel ever greater sums of billions onto their side. The whole of this has spread enormously quickly throughout the world in the last few decades, but all those in power, all those involved, and all those who profit from it have been very careful to keep quiet about it, not to tell the people, and thus not to tell the general public. The truth, moreover, which is of course vehemently disputed and denied, and neither recognized nor understood by would-be connoisseurs of the whole state of affairs, that the old view of the world, on the one hand with regard to the modern industrialized countries, and on the other hand with regard to the developing countries, has long since ceased to correspond to the old views and facts. The fact is that the advent of globalization has changed everything, allowing countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, China, South Africa, and India, etc., to explosively increase their annual economic output and flood the world with goods and commodities. And that the whole thing will continue like this in the coming decades is something that people do not want to understand, although it goes without saying that energy prices are already rising worldwide, and also, despite more energy-saving machines, vehicles, and devices of all kinds, the demand for electrical energy will increase extremely quickly and enormously in every respect. This is not only happening in the industrial sector, but also in the hospitality industry, the national economy and households, whereby we must also not overlook the greatly increased tourism, which in many ways requires an enormous amount of energy. All this also results in the fact that the worldwide demand for energy is increasing at an ever more horrendous rate. And another fact is also that worldwide there is no more economical use of energy resources, so that every admonition and declaration regarding the need to save energy will go out like a sound and vanish like smoke. Even any improved technology and more efficient use of energy that are introduced have no chance of improving anything. On the contrary, they are used to make things even worse in the old style. The economic growth that is also increasingly taking place in the emerging developing countries has the consequence that a certain prosperity is also rising in these countries, and ensures that the same criminally insensitive actions are taken with regard to every unnecessary energy consumption, as in the prosperous industrialized countries. And with that, I think I have once again touched on the most important facts that cannot be repeated enough, and need to be mentioned over and over again, until they perhaps make some earthling or other think for once.
Contact Report 721.
Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel, and had experienced some increase in prosperity under them, even though the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious-oriented rule, which is why it was opportune for the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of a resurrection of the crucified Emmanuel and to call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the human beings who were poor suffered great hardship and were only too happy to believe in and fall prey to a new religion of salvation. If the old scrolls writings are examined, which are supposed to come from disciples, direct followers and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives or from family members of the two proclaimers, then all such alleged written proofs correspond altogether to only sneaky and disingenuous falsifications, wrong memories only partly true, and wrong renditions as well as very fallible interpretations by the scribes.
Contact Report 722.
However, all unjust rulers and officials also use their obsession with power to terrorize other states, to threaten them, to insolently impose demands on them, and to drive their peoples into the greatest misery with trade and economic wars, as is done with punitive tariffs and sanctions. Sanctions in particular are to be understood as particularly criminal and inhuman machinations, because they are not only directed against the rulers who are in a clinch with another government imposing sanctions, because basically the entire people is always affected, who effectively have done nothing or can do nothing to bring about or lift this nonsense. And such sanctions are not only mindless, unreasonable, and inhumane, but clearly and distinctly to be described as crimes, because the populations of sanctioned states are deprived of their rights to acquire necessary necessities of life. Therefore, it is a fact that only criminal and inhuman and humanly degenerate elements, as miserable rulers, use their delusions of power to impose sanctions on other states. And if we look at all earthly governments and organizations, which are usually led by religious delusionists and believers in God's delusion, then we realize that these rulers or despots live out their desire for revenge against other state leaders who do not comply with the demands, but preserve their own freedom of choice. And for this they are punished by the despots with sanctions, which in no way affect the rulers of the foreign states, but rather their populations, who in no way have anything to say, and are not involved in governmental power, and are therefore innocent of the whole thing. Due to the bullshit of having to be flawless, the entire food-growing farmers, orchard owners, as well as market gardeners, etc. are put under very strong economic pressure, which many can hardly or not at all cope with. So they resort to poison spraying, and everything is sprayed with poison using CO2-generating motor vehicles, which is much more convenient than having a poison sprayer on your back and a poison spray wand in your hand. And it also saves a lot of money that would have to be laid out and paid for expensive labor wages. The same happens with the application or spraying of fungicides and insecticides over the crops, as well as with herbicides or weed killers, which save weeding and careful monitoring of the crops. But that's not all, because the chemical industry has long been so well equipped that it already poisons the seeds that are then sown, whereby the poison in the seed is then immediately transferred to the plant, and is also present in the organic vegetables. With regard to the extremely susceptible varieties of vegetables, herbs, fruit, and potatoes, which are particularly endangered by various fungal diseases and insect infestations, seed producers also supply the corresponding chemical poison to protect these varieties, which of course at least doubles the commercial and financial profit. In addition, due to all the poison spraying, every farmer, fruit grower, and market gardener no longer has to worry about producing immaculate natural and organic products or about any pests, because the thoughts, worries, and problems in this regard only fall to the consumers, but they do not care at all, because obviously a straight cucumber is worth much more to them than one that is crooked. Renewable energies have become an important economic factor for some time now, but they will neither solve the steadily increasing energy problem, nor have any significant effect on reversing the climate catastrophe. Moreover, my foresight indicates that electric cars will also fuel the energy problem, because the more of these vehicles that come onto the roads, the more electrical energy will be needed. On the other hand, electric cars also have a poor CO2 balance. The natural production of food, fruit, vegetables, and fodder produces carbon dioxide in particular, which is harmful to the climate, and ejects it into the atmosphere. In this respect, the entire agricultural sector, that is to say the worldwide agricultural and market gardening operations, etc., as well as all plantations of all kinds, as the world's most comprehensive economic sector, effectively correspond to the greatest CO2 production. And this far-reaching economic sector bears the greatest blame for climate change or climate destruction, which is effectively not of normal natural origin, but has been conjured up by all the destructive machinations of the gross overpopulation, in order to cover their food and necessities of all kinds, etc. The fact is that, because the world's agricultural and large-scale gardening enterprises, etc., are the most extensive sector of the economy, they produce the most CO2. The fact is that deforestation will continue to increase rapidly in all countries of the earth, especially in tropical countries, because the pressure for further land reclamation will inevitably increase in relation to the growing overpopulation. In the process, as has been the case for a long time, and is also the case now and in the future, more and more political and social problems will arise as a result of overpopulation, which will play important roles and will be difficult to solve. In this respect, the entire agricultural economy will be affected, as well as the empire of the energy corporations, the entire multifaceted economic system, technological developments, as well as social norms and values, and much more. If we are now talking about the rainforest and all forests and trees, then I think I can also draw somewhat on my knowledge in this regard, and say that if even something is understood about the tree economy, and thus also about the timber industry, then the whole thing must also be considered from a purely economic point of view. Actually, I wanted to talk about illegal logging before I just had to mention some things because I was forced to, but now it is done. But now it is to be said that I will also have to mention a few things about wood pests, which I learned a lot about from Svath in my juveniles, and from my time working in the forest with my father and Forester Schweizer. But first I must come to the conclusion that effectively certain necessary conversions of forest areas must also be considered and carried out, because this is really unavoidable. Subsequently, it must be recognized, when the characteristics of many kinds of goods and services with regard to forests are considered, that they are by no means profitable, but only extremely intensively labor-intensive. Forests that are supposed to grow good wood require decades of diverse work and care, which takes a lot of effort, strength, and hardship, and corresponds to a long-term and continuous process, because timber trees need many decades to reach a harvestable age. Moreover, there are no real markets for forests that would make their preservation profitable, although it is also important to note that forests are also CO2 reservoirs and that their oxygen production is also important. Good tree management is not only very laborious in terms of decades of work and care, but it also requires, which I learned from my father, from Svath, and from the community forester when I was 6 years old, and worked in the forest with my father and the forester, that sequencing is also of great importance for tree or silviculture. This means that a determination or formation of a sequence and production must be thought through and carried out as part of a production planning and production sequence to be determined. Furthermore, it must be said that forests are also overexploited by incorrect management and, as a result of ignorance and stupidity, destroyed or driven into degeneration, whereby they lose the ability to regenerate and consequently become extremely susceptible to pests, as well as to the danger of forest fires. And if the forest pests are added, then a wide variety of animals and creatures come to the fore, various game and insects, as well as even plants that feed on forest trees. Although this is a natural process, it becomes problematic when the forest is no longer able to provide important services for human beings, such as when pests appear in excessive numbers and become invasive or spread widely. This is precisely the case when mass propagation occurs, such as with the bark beetle from the family of species-rich weevils, of which many species reproduce under the bark or in the wood of trees in self-drilled tunnels and which sometimes cause great economic damage, about which little or nothing is known in the population, but which is certainly interesting to mention. For example, most bark beetle species penetrate the bark of timber and eat everything. Many species feed on the somewhat nutrient-rich part of the so-called leader bundle, which serves to transport the substances formed in the leaves within a tree. Bark beetles are not beetles and grubs that only attack conifers, because although some are only found on one group of related tree species, such as a particular genus, most wood-eating species are targeted at quite different types of wood, with a few even attacking hardwoods and even various conifers. For plants that have only been around since the alleged discovery of America in 1492, which is an enormous mistake, because Christopher Columbus was not the first to set foot on American soil from foreign lands, but very early on other human beings who came via the early still existing land connection of today's Bering Strait. This on the one hand. Then, about 2,200 years ago, the early Chinese found their way by ship to the American continent, and more than 1,000 years ago, the Norwegian-Icelandic navigator and explorer Erik Thor Valdsen, who was called Erik the Red, deliberately introduced into Europe, but as others were also accidentally introduced and were partly invasive and ran wild. The term neophyte, which literally means new planters, stands for. These invasive introduced non-native plant species in Europe have since become established, and through their proliferation, have become problem plants because they displace native plants. However, these plants are only invasive if they really spread uncontrollably and displace native plant species, thereby disrupting the interactions between living organisms and their environment in an economic or ecological way and causing damage, but also endangering human health under certain circumstances. But let us return to the bark beetle, which in Switzerland is combated almost exclusively with mechanical measures and means, namely by felling infested trees, stripping their bark, transporting them away, and using them for their intended purpose. It is also important to say that the use of plant protection products has been greatly reduced in Swiss forests, and this is also because forests are an ecosystem in which an extremely complex community of insects, animals, birds, and all kinds of other creatures and plants play a very important role.
Contact Report 723.
Basically, all the beginning will be due to devious manipulations by the most authoritative intelligence agency of the USA. The result will be that in 30 years' time the USA will fail in a secret operation in Persia, and will suffer a humiliation that will not be accepted, but will turn into revenge. The consequence will be, which will be kept secret in all areas of government, and in the secret services themselves, as well as especially from the current president of the USA and his successor, that an intrigue will be set up by 6 vengeful Secret Service agents on their own initiative, which will lead to a war between Persia and Iraq from 1980 to 1988. This war will end with very high human and economic losses on both sides, but neither side will emerge victorious, and the end will be a ceasefire. This, however, will be reason enough for the next president of the USA, who will be next in 40 years, to invade Iraq 2 or 3 years after taking office through lies and deceit, and also on behalf of the UN Security Council, which was founded in 1945, and to wage a war that will be justified by the need to liberate Kuwait, which is to be incorporated into Iraq by order of the Iraqi dictatorship. Some 12 years later, a son of this president of the USA will also be elevated to the office of president, who will then want to finish his father's work and force Iraq under the thumb of the USA, after which he will start another Iraq war in 54 years. This will then be the prelude to anarchy, rebellion, hatred, and ever-increasing political disorder, chaos, assassinations, and wars, as well as all kinds of mischief, spreading throughout the country and also to other Arab countries, and continuing in this way for many decades. For a long time to come, far into the new millennium, the entire USA intelligence manipulations and the political and military machinations of the USA will cause strife, hatred, wars, and evil mischief in the entire Arab region, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, as well as in Persia, Korea, and in other Asian countries, and in South America. And the hatred created by all these manipulations of the USA, its secret services, military and politics will create the great terror and crime organization in Arabia, spreading death, suffering, hardship, and disaster.
Contact Report 733.
Then, unfortunately, it is so. But what do your forecasts for the next month say?
Nothing encouraging, because the number of people infected by the virus will be in the millions, and the death toll in the hundreds of thousands by the end of April. Despite the fact that certain governmental measures are being implemented in various countries, which will somewhat mitigate the rapid spread of the coronavirus pandemic. But then, when a larger part of the population reasonably begins to get used to the measures and regulations restricting daily life, these will be relaxed and lifted again far too quickly and far too soon, causing the state of infections and deaths to increase again. And this will be due to the double bean-straw stupidity, unreasonableness, and successful blackmail of the state leaders who will bow to the demands of the entire multifarious economy, resulting in the fact that already in 1 month it will be decided to obey the blackmailing of the economic powers. This is because all the world's economic powers see in their commercial behavior, which dominates them, a financial collapse which they are beginning to recognize as imminent. The leaders of many countries will irrationally and irresponsibly give in to this all-round threat and the blackmail-like demands of the economy, thereby inevitably increasing the danger of a renewed spread of the epidemic. This on the one hand, while on the other hand, the governmental decrees of the relaxation of measures will lead to the fact that parts of the populations therein will erroneously assume that the great danger has been averted. Consequently, all necessary safety measures will be disregarded and negligent actions will be taken. Consequently, the infections will increase again and will also cause new deaths.
Idiotic, but nothing can be done about it, because the greed for money of all the economic bosses, as well as the stupidity, incompetence, and blackmailability of the majority of the unjust and unwise rulers, is more powerful than all reason and rationality. But look here, these questions come up again and again, because exactly last night, shortly after 1:30 HRS, a Mrs.
Contact report 739.
Damage will also be done to large masses of the population because they have been misled by the economic crisis and the economic powers that be, who have allowed themselves to be seduced or even bribed into false lockdown measures that are inappropriate and not in line with the circumstances.
Then I now have another question for you in relation to the machinations of those in power. When I watch the news on television, I notice over and over again that those in power, who are responsible for the state and thus for the people, stupidly let out new stupid and crazy slogans and proposals for this, that, and the other. This for new ordinances, state holdings in ailing companies, corporations and associations and sports clubs, etc., all in all. However, everything is just bullshit, nonsense and idiocy, like especially the participation or the financial under-the-arm grabbing of poor economic powers, whose companies and corporations are suffering as a result of the corona epidemic and have to be supported financially in order to preserve jobs, etc. This while the bosses of the companies are suffering from the corona epidemic. This while the bosses of the firms and corporations sit fine and carefree with their millions and billions in assets, not putting a cent of their mammon into their firm or corporation. The stupid heads of state, however, do so at the expense of the taxpayers, who are then simply forced to pay new and higher taxes in every possible way in order to fill the state coffers, which have been pumped empty by the stupid rulers. But the majority of the stupid, immature population is still cheering because they only see their own well-being, but not reality and truth, and as a result of their stupidity, cannot even recognize it. Instead of the bosses of companies and corporations budgeting correctly with their money, and those in power budgeting correctly with the state's money, instead of overfilling their own pockets with money, and also squandering the money on nonsense, and also making provisions for times of need, debts are piled up upon debts, for which the social stratum of the working classes must then pay again with new or increased taxes of all kinds. To this, Ptah, I would like to know what you think.
I can only answer this in the way you have often expressed it, namely that the whole of what you have explained corresponds to the truth, and this clearly shows the incompetence of the majority of all those state leaders and economic powers who behave and act in the way you have explained. The whole thing clearly exposes what is a given with these irresponsible leaders, namely bullshit. There is nothing more to be said.
Contact report 747.
From the beginning of the corona epidemic, the populations of all countries have hardly, extremely reluctantly, or not at all adhered to the halfway good and correct health precautions, as well as precautionary and safety measures prescribed by the state and the authorities. When all those incompetent, arrogant, irresponsible, and self-important state officials, who, as a result of their complete misjudgment of the entire situation of the corona epidemic, and because of the harassment that has arisen from the various economic sectors, allowed themselves to be tempted to relax the lockdown, which was otherwise already held far too loosely, the incomprehension, indifference and irresponsibility of the majority of the population also overflowed, as a result of which the pandemic is now ravaging everywhere. The lockdown was correct and justified, but due to the ignorance and irrationality of the majority of the population, as well as the majority of the fallible state powers, who hastily relaxed the lockdown, the number of infections and deaths has now increased drastically throughout the world.
Contact Report 748.
They do not do this because for them, the running and operation of the economic corporations is more important, and much more important than the health and life of the populations. Thanks to this irrational and illogical thinking, acting and behavior, the corona death rate will inevitably also rise alarmingly fast, and in addition to the corona death toll, which has already exceeded the 1,000,000 mark for some time now, the 1,000,000 death toll will also be officially mentioned very quickly. To all that has now been said, it is unfortunately to be explained that despite this, the majority of those responsible, the state powers and authorities, in order to promote the will of the economic lobby or the entirety of the institutions, companies and corporations, and with regard to the measures concerning the production and consumption of all economic goods, keep the populations in the dark about the great danger of the corona epidemic.
Contact Report 757.
3. If one observes the forces which, in the state leaderships, offices, and authorities, invoke the economy, as is the case everywhere in all industrialized countries, which are also joined by unreasonable other forces in other states, then it can be seen that the whole thing is getting more out of hand every day. The leaders of all states, which is also the case in Switzerland, are incapable of assessing the situation and taking measures in accordance with the wishes of the economic giants, who are only interested in making a profit. The state leaders, offices, and authorities are criminally aligning themselves in their inability to lead with regard to the health and safety of the people in such a way that the corona epidemic will inevitably not be brought under control until the next century and will claim millions of lives. This is the case in all European states equally and without exception, as well as in various other states, whereby, however, the United States of America in particular leads the world in all irrationality and governmental incompetence. This through the fault of incompetent state leaders, which, however, will not only claim masses of corona deaths, but will also cause political unrest.
Contact Report 765.
What has happened so far with regard to the corona rampantly spreading disease in terms of absolute inadequacy and confusion can be traced back on the one hand to the inept rulers, who have always been incapable and are also incapable now of combating such crises, such as epidemics, correctly. Until today, due to stupidity or non-thinking, they have never learned to create the correct security measures according to the basic law and the Constitution. That is to say, to take them and to enforce them by virtue of the state constitution with regard to health and safety for the good of the people through the deployment of all necessary security and law and order organs. This is because they are just as incapable of asserting themselves against all the obstructionism of the obstructionists, who, in complete stupidity, and thus as a result of their inability to think, demonstratively invoke inadequate basic rights and destroy private as well as state property. As they are against the economic powers, the cults of divine faith and the big and small businessmen, etc. on the other hand. However, it is also that part of the population itself, that of the stupid and the ricocheting, which always amounts to between 20 and 30%, from which terror is always made, and disaster is always conjured up, which also always causes many deaths through their fault. But to talk further about this would be futile and pointless. This corresponds to an absolutely idiotic and irresponsible action, which leads to thousands of infections and costs thousands of human lives. But as long as incompetent rulers sit at the helm of the state, palavering stupidly and imbecilically, hoping for help from an imaginary god and sneaking around the asses of the economic powers that be and doing what they want, nothing will change for the correct and sensible. Similarly, nothing will change for the better and the good if the third of the population's lunatics and madmen, stupid and impudent people as well as troublemakers, know-it-alls and conspiracy believers are not stopped and not put off course, who in many cases also spread the disease through their pathologically imbecilic behavior.
Contact Report 775,
That which the future of the humankind of the Earth's world will bring in the coming time, far into the third millennium, emerges from different views, for example, from very clear foresights, and from far forethought considerations, probability calculations, and real visions, as well as from observing the times. These were repeated several times and clearly and unmistakably clarify the evidence that in the coming times and far into the third millennium, inevitably everything will happen such as I have to describe it, wherethrough the truth is spread, and the human beings of Earth shall learn much from it. For example, that in the north of the Middle East in the new third millennium, after the second decade, the capital and the district capitals will be largely destroyed by religious fanatics, and the whole country will collapse economically, or because primeval storms will destroy much with regard to dwellings, because these are built in places which should remain free, so that the waters can drain away, which in the coming future as a result of a man-made climatic catastrophe will pelt from the sky as flash floods. Therefore, truthfully, the USA's worldwide expansion in the form of economic and military power was secretly discussed, which, however, absolutely nobody of the Congress participants became conscious of. Thus, the United States of America was appointed as the global might of order, and since then, it can act blamelessly right into the future of the third millennium and spread everywhere over the whole earth, and indulge its desire of world domination undisturbed due to the written permission of all NATO members. The foundation of the European dictatorship will come about under a well-thought-out secret and many decades-long cloak of lies, a supposedly peaceful connecting union of states of all European countries. It is falsely stated that it is to serve a peacefully uniting union, from which, however, thanks to rational governors, Switzerland will be able to keep itself out to a certain extent. Nonetheless, the simple-minded ones and those that are densely of low intelligentum will want to betray the homeland, because elements without intellect and rationality, women and men, will, as conscienceless and dictatorship-believing supporters, strive to integrate Switzerland into the dictatorship. It will calculatingly strive for and set in motion the economic and political boom, as well as the monetary currency including the dictatorship countries, a currency that will be brought in compulsorily in 1999 and put into circulation in 2002. This is to become the official means of cohesion for the dictatorship, which in reality, however, will serve to ensure the dependence of the individual states on Brussels, the headquarters of the dictatorship, and to keep the member states in line. The ones of low intelligentum, who do not think for themselves, will be the ones to suffer and bear the damage, while the self-thinking and clever ones will hold back from the European monetary currency, and sooner or later leave the dictatorship again, as England will do when it has had enough of the dictatorship, and then seek the end of membership.
Contact Report 779.
America will be the might of the world far into the 21st century, not only through its military power, but also politically, technically, economically, and religiously sectarian fanatically. A particular sect will dominate those human beings who become of the belief that they are better and more clever beings than the normal human beings. Their confused and erroneous belief, which a writer will invent and found a sect with, will make those human beings his slaves who will believe themselves superior to normal human beings. Their erroneous belief, according to the writer's sense, will be that their being will be spiritual, although the term spirit is only an invented name for that which is supposed to explain the human being's life instinct as well as the intellect and reason, but which is basically called by the correct term, the energy of creation. This provides the energy and power in human beings that is erroneously attributed to an imaginary spirit that is imagined and thus invented, which is supposed to be all-embracingly effective, of divine nature and life-giving, even though the imaginary form of spirit invented by human beings corresponds to nothing other than a stupid and faith-philosophical erroneous idea and imagination, and thus to a special delusion, namely, a delusion of faith. Such a delusion arises as a result of a lack of understanding and reason. That is to say, through lack of understanding and reason, when the human being, due to a lack of intelligentum, attentiveness, attention and recognition of real reality and its truth, is incapable of processing and fathoming a matter of any kind, logically through thought and reflection in consciousness. Consequently, he is neither able to process nor to understand or comprehend anything. Every belief necessarily demands from the human being a basic attitude of an imagined blind trust in something that he accepts as true and just believes, in the sense of a context of all the unconsidered elements of the interrelationships. And so, from every faith situation, or from all authoritative religious and the philosophically indoctrinated foreign convictions that inevitably emerge from it, or from the self-convictions, the delusional belief in something that does not correspond to the truth and not to reality results. This, as also arises in further and everyday forms, as in respect of political, military, atheistic, ideological, and scientific ways, namely that a delusion arises from it that rejects all reality. Faith in God, military faith, political faith, faith in science, as well as faith in atheism, and general faith in philosophy, belief in world views, and faith in sex will also ensure murder and manslaughter in the future. This, as it will be in the case of the new American sect, which in the coming time will arise from the writer's mad idea, and will spread and cause murders, and find its way into the U.S. government machinery, as well as into the politics of many countries.
Contact Report 788.
You are addressing something to which Earth human beings are currently moving more and more, because they have always been inclined to use gay vault to enforce their will. This is also evident in what the leaders of Europe and America are doing, namely by striving to extend their influence further into Asia, by wanting to extend the might of NATO into the East, and thereby pressuring other states with it. The dictatorship of the European Union is also playing a part in this, whose member states, or the part of the people that is still halfway capable of thinking, is slowly realizing that the aim of this EU is actually to deprive the affiliated states of their own state constitution and decision-making power, in order to finally make the state a vassal of the dictatorship. However, those states that are still halfway thinking will defend themselves against this and, in time, will put the EU dictatorship under pressure, if it does not continue to exist forever, even by torpedoing renegade states economically in such a way that even their EU-friendly peoples will have to realize that the European Union is effectively a malicious and freedom-robbing dictatorship that will try to assert itself with all evil means of gavolt, up to and including the death penalty.
Contact Report 797.
The USA, or United States of America, is economically as well as militarily a might that has always strived for world domination, but slowly in the coming decades and centuries, America will lose its importance. America will not last forever despite its lies and deceit and its dirty warmongering that despises human lives. It will be hit by events that will shake the very existence of the state in various ways, and ultimately dissolve the very existence of the American community in its basic structures. America, as it still is today, will be defined by its history and dissolved in the following times.
Contact Report 813.
By supplying weapons to Ukraine, the war can continue unabated for a long time and cause many deaths and destruction, on the one hand for the benefit of the warmongering Zelensky, but on the other hand also for the benefit of the USA, which is extremely addicted to world domination. The current world war was also triggered by their negative and underhanded efforts, because with the start of the arms deliveries to Ukraine, the whole thing became a global concern. Even though it is currently a global economic war, but it can continue to become dangerous, how shall I put it, and escalate, it is still.
Contact Report 820.
And what is to be said regarding invasive trees? That relates to the following. Especially silvicultural concepts based on site-appropriate tree species selection would be a necessity to be discussed. because an adequate participation of invasive tree stands that are as good as possible would meet economic demands and nature conservation goals in equal measure. The most important tree species would have to be listed, and in addition there are already cultivations of coast and noble firs Abies grandis, A. procera, trees of life Thuja plicata, hemlocks Tsuga spec, black walnut trees Juglans nigra, as well as balsam poplars and poplar hybrids Populus spec. On a small scale in Europe, the tree genus or species must, however, be adapted to the soil and to the present and future climate, and should be given the location that is necessary for it to grow and thrive, just as any other plant requires. If this does not happen, or if there are other plants that repel the foreigners, then competition arises. An economic role is currently played by the invasive trees Douglas fir and strobe, which, after more than 100 years of introduction, allow us to realistically assess the cultivation and the possibilities and risks of Douglas fir. The tree Douglas fir regenerates generatively in the forest via seeds, but the regeneration of the tree allows the competition between the other growth and different tree species to be well controlled by silvicultural means. The concerns of the delusionists about invasiveness and conservation with regard to impacts on native trees and other flora, animals, fauna, and other creatures are unobjectionable, and furthermore, they inevitably change and consequently adapt. It is a fact that the Douglas fir is already involved to a certain extent in the stocking of the tree population in Europe. Furthermore, foreign tree species are also already found in urban areas. In parks, gardens, and in tree plantations along traffic routes, etc., fast-growing tree species, for example, already occupy a special position, with tree cultivation for biomass production for energy generation coming to the fore, especially for heating purposes. One can even speak of energy forests in this respect, whereby mostly balsam poplars and poplar hybrids are cultivated for this purpose.